plot. There was a paper that was written that was proposing sugar was causing the obesity. And they had this plot, and they went all the way back to 1900, and it kind of went up slowly. It hit 1975, and it made a corner, and it was going up like this after 75. That's when glyphosate got introduced. And I can see how glyphosate would cause obesity because it messes up the CYP enzymes in the liver, which are essential for detoxifying other toxic chemicals. And you have all of these sort of organic compounds that are toxic that go from way back, like the PCPs and the POPs, you know, all these organic chemicals that are very toxic. And if you can't break them down in the liver, you've got to store them somewhere. And so the trick is to get fat, because then you can dump all these chemicals into your fat tissues and sequester them so that the rest of your body will be protected.
So they're buffering the toxic burden.
Yes,
better.
that's right. Okay. They have a way to hide it so that it's not impacting their body as much as this thin person who can't do that.
Dr. Seneff, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Absolutely. So you've been really instrumental in helping us understand the toxicology of glyphosate and how it affects the human biology and the gut microbiome. Let's kind of talk about how you got into glyphosate and maybe start at what is glyphosate and how does it affect humans?
Yeah, so glyphosate is the active ingredient in the pervasive herbicide Roundup, which is used, people buy it at the hardware store and use it to kill the weeds in their yard. And it's extensively used in agriculture. More and more every year, and it's been the amount being used has gone up dramatically over the last 15-20 years, in step with the dramatic increase in the number of crops that are engineered, genetically engineered, to be resistant to Roundup. And so what's happening is that we're getting a lot more exposure to Roundup in the food every year than we did the year before.
Now, why is it? So it increases yield, or it prevents waste? Like, what does it do?
It makes it very, very easy to grow crops, because the ones that are engineered, the core ones are the corn, the soy, the canola, the sugar beets, the alfalfa. These are all crops that we grow huge amounts of in the United States and in Canada. The canola is in Canada, and you can just take an airplane and just spray the fields with the glyphosate, and it goes all over the crop, and you don't care because the crop won't die. That's what the GMO gene has done. It's protected the crop from being killed by glyphosate, but it doesn't protect it from soaking it up. And it makes it much, much easier to control the weeds, because ordinarily you would have to kind of pre-treat the soil with the glyphosate before you plant, and then wait long enough to get the glyphosate to work its way out before you can even plant the seed. So this is a much more difficult way to manage the weeds, because then whatever weeds grow while the crops are growing, you're stuck with those, right? Because you can't spray the weeds unless you have to be very, very careful to just spray the weed and not affect the crop. Much, much harder to control the weeds if you can't just spray everything and not worry about the crop. Yeah,
wow, that's amazing. So let's talk about the effects that it has on humans when we consume it. So some of the blogs that I've read that are pro-glyphosate, you know, written by maybe farmers that are kind of like some way affiliated with companies that make this material. You know, they say that the wheat is sprayed, but it's so little and it's late in the harvest and it doesn't really, you know, get into the human finished product. Is that true or not so true?
We don't know, actually, because there's so little testing going on. This is one thing that really shocks me, because it is a huge amount of Roundup is used in the United States. We consume 25% of the world's market in this country. So here we're getting more exposure than anywhere else on average. And the government thinks it's perfectly safe, because Monsanto claims that they proved it was safe 30 years ago. And when you go back, and I've got friends who are actually studying those reports that supposedly indicated that it was safe, and they're finding that it's not true. Even from their own studies, there's evidence of harm, particularly things like cancer. My friends are starting to find this out. So they found ways to sort of make it look as if it was safe, and then they were able to kind of force that through the regulatory agencies. So I personally believe that the companies that produce this product know it's not safe. But they're so thrilled with the amount of money they're making off of it that they don't want that game to end. And they're willing to just let people get sick for some reason, which I find very surprising. But
yeah. So at what point in human history or agriculture did this become so pervasive? You said about 30 years ago they did some of these toxicology studies. When did it become a major problem?
Yeah, well, so they introduced glyphosate for the first time really in 1975. So before that there was none in the environment. And of course, DDT had just been sort of phased out, and so that was a big, huge bonus. You know, so we had a short period of time of glory, really, when we didn't have either DDT or glyphosate. My personal feeling is that glyphosate is much worse than DDT, and DDT, of course, has been shown to be very toxic. Glyphosate was introduced in '75, and then they didn't introduce a GMO Roundup Ready crops until 1996. So they were using glyphosate, but much, much less during that period. But then starting in '96, and they started ramping up all these GMOs, and now you've got like 90% of all those crops, 90% of the crop is GMO Roundup Ready. And they've actually, the government has tracked how much glyphosate is being used on corn and soy and wheat, so you can get those numbers off the web, which we've done, and you can plot those trends, and you can see that they're going way up, you know. In step with a dramatic increase in a whole bunch of diseases that match very, very well.
With consumption of those foods.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, yes. Well, no, the diseases match with the amount of glyphosate that's being used on the crop. So this is a very general measure of how much glyphosate is being, you know, bought and used on the crops every year in the country, and then how much is this disease going up, like diabetes and autism and ADHD and Alzheimer's and chronic fatigue. Well, I don't know about chronic fatigue, but various gut problems, celiac disease, irritable bowel syndrome, kidney disease, kidney cancer, you know, liver disease. All these things are all going up in frequency in the population in step with this increase in glyphosate. The curves match very, very well.
Now, maybe for those that haven't seen your other videos, how did you stumble upon this correlation in this data?
Yeah, well, that's kind of an interesting story all by itself. I didn't really start studying autism. I was interested in autism because I was seeing that the rates were going up dramatically. Even back 8 years ago, I was worried because I could see that it looked like exponential growth, and exponential growth is a scary thing. And so I was frustrated that it looked like most of the research dollars were going towards genetics, you know, looking at genetic predisposition factors that might be increasing risk. And they weren't getting very far. They were finding all kinds of genes that had all kinds of small effects, you know, a very complicated situation. And I was just sure it must be something environmental because, and genetics doesn't change that fast. You know, genetics is a slow thing. So why would you suddenly be getting so many more? So I was looking for something environmental, and I started looking with the vaccines because I had heard a lot of parents' testimonies that their child was fine until they got this vaccine. They ran a high fever, they had some seizures, and they dropped down into autism. So I was pretty convinced, and I am still pretty convinced that the vaccines are playing a role. So I looked into the vaccines and I found aluminum, of course mercury, which is well established. MMR has glutamate, and I didn't recognize the glutamate as potentially toxic until I figured out the glyphosate. So the glyphosate was a major, major breakthrough, and that only happened 3 years ago. For me personally, I went to a conference in Indianapolis where I heard Professor Don Huber speak for 2 hours. He is a plant expert in plant pathology, retired professor from Purdue, a wonderful man, and he has been, like me, going all around the world giving talks saying glyphosate is toxic, we've got to get this off the market. And so I heard his 2-hour talk, and he specifically talked about the gut microbes. And I was already well aware that there was a gut microbe problem in association with autism, and I was looking for something that might be causing that. So it was very perfect that he gave me the answer I was looking for in that lecture. And that lecture changed my life because I went back home and I immediately started reading everything I could about glyphosate. I sort of dropped everything else I was doing, and I hit pay dirt because I could just see, and it was incredible how all of these features of what glyphosate does to biological systems, and then you look at what is a characteristic of autism, and they line up in multiple, multiple ways. It is so perfect. And then on top of that, you have a 0.997 correlation coefficient between these curves that show the increased rate of autism in first grade, according to the school's compensation program, and the amount of glyphosate that was used the previous 4 years on the crops. So it's sort of looking at the age of 2 to the age of 6 in the child's life.
Wow.
Perfect match.
Goodness. Now, let's talk about the gut microbes, but before we do, I've heard you say that I think 1 in 52 children present now in 2015 have autism. But you said, I think by 2025, 1 in 2?
I did say by 2025, and I imagine that, I will admit I probably exaggerated, but I didn't exaggerate by much, and I even still think it's possible I'm right. If you simply do the straight math, and you look at the CDC's own data, going back to 1975, and you draw that curve, and you will see that it's exponential, because if you take a log, you'll get a straight line. That's characteristic of exponential growth. That makes it very easy to just extend that line, find out where it intersects. And if you do that, you find 2032 is the magic number. 2032, 7 years later than what I said. If we stay the course, which I see no reason why we won't, because that's what we are doing. We're making things worse every year. This year we're introducing a new endless duo for the crops, which is going to be both glyphosate and 2,4-D, because they're recognizing that glyphosate, there are certain weeds that are coming that are so resistant they just can't put enough glyphosate on there to kill them. This is the reason why the glyphosate's going up. So they're saying, well, we've got to put another toxic chemical with the glyphosate to kill the weeds. And 2,4-D is a component of Agent Orange, and it's a regulated herbicide. It's supposed to be much more toxic than glyphosate, and these things are always synergistically toxic. You know, they work together and they cause really strange additional damage beyond what each one would have done individually. All these chemicals tend to have that effect. Mm-hmm. So I can't imagine what's coming down the road with this combo showing up on all our core crops, and they've gotten approval, no problem, the government's fine with that. They've got resistance to 2,4-D, resistance to glyphosate in the same crop, and then they have this endless duo, which has those two things in it to poison the weeds and poison the, and contaminate the crops.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, I would love for you to expand upon, if you would, the synergism there, because we often see in toxicology studies these new to market compounds are studied in isolation. They're never studied synergistically together. And so maybe talk about, for folks that aren't familiar with that term in toxicology and that synergism, and you said that it's not just a 1 + 1 = 2, it's more of a
You are absolutely right, and this is something I think people miss. And of course the industry is happy to study them in isolation. They even sort of make it formal that that's the requirement. So glyphosate, way back when they said, oh yes, this stuff is safe, they studied it in isolation. And what that means, it wasn't even in the context of the products in which it's used in. Even forget about 2,4-D. The glyphosate itself, they add all kinds of stuff to that to make the formulation. And they add those things to make it more toxic to the plants. So guess what? If it's more toxic to the plants, it's going to be more toxic to us too. But they don't have to study that, because that's just not part of the protocol, And 1,000 times more toxic is what a study showed when they looked at the active ingredient for various herbicides, the active ingredient versus that ingredient embedded in the product, where they have these additional chemicals that are intended to make the membranes of the cells permeable so that the glyphosate can get in. So when you have the glyphosate alone, it doesn't get into the cell, it doesn't cause problems. You add these chemicals, the glyphosate gets in, the cell dies. 1,000-fold more toxic, and so it's just crazy to me that the government's fine with that. Oh yeah, you studied it in isolation, it didn't cause any problems. The other trick they use is only 3 months. So they said, they set up the rule, you study exposure to a rat for 3 months, and as long as you don't see any difference between that and the control group, then you're good to go. So Seralini did a study. He studied the rats over the entire lifespan. 3 months, things looked pretty good. 4 months, you start to see problems. Whole lifespan, you get early death, you get mammary tumors, you get liver and kidney damage, you get reproductive problems. All these things show up after 3 months.
Wow. And these compounds, are they surfactants you said that they put in there? So
they are
basically,
surfactants.
We're trying to get the glyphosate into the plant cell wall, basically to puncture the cell wall, but plants have cell walls, we have cell membranes.
Yes.
Does that translate? Talk
to
us.
It does. I mean, that's what happens, is that these things actually they dissolve the fatty acids, and they make it permeable. And then they're also adding other things. I've been rummaging through the web looking at Monsanto patents, which is a great way to figure out what's in those products. And we've come across several, going back to the late 1990s, that talk about oxalic acid being added to the product. So they talk in these patents about, oh geez, if you add this oxalic acid, it makes it more toxic to the plants, makes it better weed killer. And then they introduce new product lines, and you don't know if that has that oxalic acid in it or not, because everything is under patent control. So we don't know what's in those products, but we can guess that if they're talking about patents and then they come out with this new product, maybe they've got the oxalic acid in there. And especially when you start to see increased incidence of kidney stones and cysts, and these are things that are connected to oxalic acid. So, people are having issues with oxalate poisoning, or excess oxalate, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, that's crystallizing out as calcium oxalate and causing a lot of problems in the kidneys, and the cysts in the ovarian cysts, and then it can also crystallize out in the brain and it can cause pain. It can crystallize in the blood vessels. So I mean, that stuff's dangerous.
Pretty toxic.
And I think that it's also interesting when you look at the chemistry that oxalate is a breakdown product of glyphosate, and in between you have glyoxylate. So if you're adding oxalate, it's going to be a product inhibition of the pathway, which is going to cause the glyoxylate to pile up, which is going to cause the glyphosate to pile up. So by virtue of adding that oxalate, I suspect it's inhibiting the ability to break down the glyphosate, which is going to make it stick around in the liver and cause more liver damage. And the glyoxylate is also toxic because that's a very strong glycating agent. So it can glycate it's like causing sugar damage to the proteins, similar to what glucose does.
So there's multiple, what we would say in medicine, it's pleiotropic. There's many ways that it can cause damage. And before we kind of talk about the biology and I want to get into the gut and all that sort of stuff, I want to just kind of zoom out and say, okay, the easiest preventative solution for parents and mothers and kids and everyone to try and be healthy is just avoid foods that are sprayed with glyphosate. But
yes.
I was introduced to a study by my friend Alex Vasquez that it's found in our air and water.
Yes.
It gets everywhere. So
it does.
Talk to us maybe about where we're getting exposed and how we can prevent it.
Right. I mean, it's very difficult. You can't avoid exposure at some level. Even organic food has tested positive for glyphosate. And it's not because they're using it, it's just because it's in the water, it's in the soil, they can't, it's in the manure, they can't get it out. And there was a study, I think in Kentucky, that showed something like 84% of the water samples they got from the rain even, it's in the rain. So, and it's in the air if you're going to be living near an agricultural field, or if your neighbor or you have gone down to the hardware store and bought your Roundup and you're spraying it, you can be breathing it as you're applying it to your weeds. And people think it's harmless, so people are using it carelessly. So certainly you could stop using Roundup on your lawn and tell your neighbors to do that too if you can convince them. Buy strictly organic food. In my household we're 100% organic. When we buy groceries, we never buy anything that's not organic. And that means we have to not eat certain things we used to eat because we can't find them organically. But it's not too bad because we live near a Whole Foods and they have quite a few selections, and they're getting more all the time. So we're really excited about the increase in the demand for organic, and also with therefore a greater supply. More and more products are being offered organically every day, which is really terrific. And that makes you appreciate that people are getting the message.
Totally. Yeah,
Yes.
It's great, this grassroots effort.
It's
Consumers
terrific.
are changing the marketplace.
So consumers are the answer. I mean, the government is so contaminated at this point by the influence of money, I would say that they are not willing to budge. And I don't think we're going to get results from the government. I don't think we can wait for that. But every single consumer has the power. And you vote with your pocketbook, and that is so powerful.
Yeah.
And the farmers will rise to the occasion. I mean, when they find they don't have to expose themselves to the toxic chemicals and they can produce a product they can sell for more money, more and more farmers, I think, are going to start to figure out how to get their fields organic, and then they'll be happy with that change.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk about change. We know when seatbelts were mandatory, car manufacturers tried to boycott that forever, but seatbelts saved tons of lives. We know that smoking, for example, we know DDT. I mean, all the industries that had a financial interest in making or distributing those compounds would say that they're necessary. They don't have all these ill effects. And the logical next step would be to look at all the glyphosate, the toxicity, and say, well, that's harming children, leading to all these diseases. Why isn't the government jumping in? Why isn't the medical community jumping in?
Yeah, well, I honestly wish I had the answer to that because it puzzles me. I just feel if I were the government, I'd be worried because we've got a huge health crisis in this country. And we're so burdened by the expense of healthcare. We spend way more on healthcare than the next nation per person. We're way out front on healthcare. And it really amuses me when people say, oh, well, the U.S. has been eating these GMO crops for years, and look, they're fine. I'm like, they are? What planet are you on, And we've got all this ADHD. It's not just the autism, allergies, food, all these different food allergies, eczema. Even my grandchildren, some of them have eczema. Luckily, I don't have any of the other things. I don't have any food allergies in my family. I'm very fortunate, no autism. but the eczema is there, and I think there's a huge portion of the kids in the population that have eczema these days, and asthma. I mean, it's just, the kids are sick, you know, and obesity, and I think the ADHD is really affecting their learning, so people are being dumbed down. I mean, it's very scary, I think, that humans are losing their abilities that they used to have. And of course, you see all these old people too who are so physically frail, and their bones are being eroded. And I think the bone issue is directly connected to the glyphosate, because it depletes manganese, and you need manganese to make chondroitin sulfate, which is very essential for bone development. So you get a lot of issues with osteoporosis and osteomalacia, you know, all these different issues with the bones. So yeah, I mean, the list goes on and on, but I didn't answer your question. So the government, I mean, obviously, because the government thinks it's safe. They definitely think it's safe, and they think Monsanto has convinced them, apparently, so thoroughly. And they're busy people. They can't take the time to read everything, and they're getting all this misinformation, in my opinion, is misinformation from the companies that's assuring them that this product, absolutely, there's no question it's safe. And they can't probably can't admit that if they are wrong all those years, they're going to have a very hard time explaining that. So they have to just keep on being wrong, right, in order to protect themselves from the embarrassment of being wrong, even in a way, perhaps. I mean, I don't know. I'm making this up because we've been frustrated. I mean, so many people have tried to contact the British government, the US government, the Canadian government. I've got friends, you know, politically active people who have just written tons of letters, and often they don't even get an acknowledgement. Wow. You know, it's just amazing. They're not interested. And so we're going to take the country down. You know, we have our 50% autism goal in 2032. We'll have healthcare costs that are completely out of sight. Anybody who's well enough is going to be spending all their time taking care of the people who are sick. And we won't have an economy. They won't be able to do anything else other than do that. So I think the country is in really big trouble if we don't figure out how to fix this problem. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's absolutely scary stuff. If you look at the obesity prevalence, I mean, 7 out of 10 adults are either overweight or obese, and you look at children.
Just that alone, the obesity, and it's interesting, as I've seen a plot. There was a paper that was written that was proposing sugar was causing the obesity, and they had this plot, and they went all the way back to 1900, and it kind of went up slowly. It hit 1975, and it made a corner, and it was going up like this after 75. That's when glyphosate got introduced, and I can see how glyphosate would cause obesity because it messes up the CYP enzymes in the liver, which are essential for detoxifying other toxic chemicals. And you have all of these sort of organic compounds that are toxic that go from way back, like the PCPs and the POPs, you know, all these organic benzene-based, all these chemicals that are very toxic. And if you can't break them down in the liver, you've got to store them somewhere. And so the trick is to get fat, because then you can dump all these chemicals into your fat tissues and sequester them so that the rest of your body will be protected. So if you don't get fat, you know, if you're like determined not to get fat, you'll get sick because those chemicals will become poisonous and they'll get into your brain.
And there's this hypothesis, the obesity paradox. So individuals that are lean, you know, when they go in and get their coronary arteries, you know, scanned, or they have a fatal heart attack, you know, they have a lot more risk. And so maybe those people are poor storers of toxic burdens.
Yes, I think so. And I think it's genetics that's going to dictate whether your body has the smarts to build all that fat tissue to store those toxins. And you think it's bad that you're fat, but actually it's good because it's protecting you. And I have read a lot of papers about the obesity paradox. That's very fascinating. And there's a lot of evidence that these various diseases, even like diabetes and heart disease, that once you are diagnosed with it, the obese people do better looking into the future than the skinny people.
Interesting. And again, so people are listening, they're kind of going, well, how would that be? So the obese people are sequestering these toxins, so they're buffering the toxic burden.
Yes,
better.
That's right. Okay. They have a way to hide it so that it's not impacting their body as much as this thin person who can't do that.
Wow. Oh my gosh. All right, so let's get into the biology a little bit. So you talked about the cytochrome P450 enzyme, so that's one mechanism. Anything else you want to, like, how does that slow it down? Is it the manganese? Like, how does the glyphosate?
Well, that relates to the manganese, but glyphosate is a fantastic metal chelator, and it particularly impacts manganese and cobalt. This has been shown in a study in cows in Denmark. They found that they looked at 8 different dairy farms in Denmark, and they found all the cows on all the farms had severe deficiency in cobalt and manganese, and those were the two. So they looked at all these different minerals, and the manganese was just amazing. It was way below the minimum value that you would expect in the range. So, you know, really depleted. And so I read that article, and that's what inspired me to say I got to take a look at manganese. And I didn't know much about manganese at that time because you don't hear much about manganese. You know, when you're talking about nutritional deficiencies, manganese kind of is off the map. I mean, I didn't even know what it did in the body, to be honest with you. But once I started reading, I was like, oh my God, because it matched so many things with autism, including manganese is needed to detoxify glutamate. And glutamate, excess glutamate in the brain is connected to autism, and glutamate is neurotoxic. So if you can't get rid of the glutamate, it's going to cause damage to your neurons. Manganese is also essential for an enzyme in the mitochondria that protect them from the damage that they incur by virtue of doing their thing. So if the manganese is not there, the mitochondria get broken, and they're the energy source of the cell. So they produce the energy, the cell's going to have no energy. And then mitochondrial deficiency, mitochondrial damage, is a very strong feature of autism, also of Alzheimer's disease. Then you have the manganese in the bones that I mentioned earlier, the chondroitin sulfate. And chondroitin sulfate is also essential in these perineuronal networks that are important for the brain structure. So you can see all kinds of ways in which the manganese deficiency would cause problems. It's also actually connected to the sperm, because the sperm use a manganese-dependent enzyme to maintain their mobility, so that you're going to get sperm that can't swim very well, which is going to impact fertility.
Wow.
And we're seeing huge problems with infertility in the population today as well. So that it sort of fits all those things. It also fits damage to the sea life, because we have sea stars. I'm trying to make this shellfish. Sea stars. Yeah, I got a little tongue twisted there. Sea stars in the Pacific Ocean that are in really big trouble these days. They've got this weird kind of melting disease that they're turning into goo, that their skeleton is really getting messed up. And they depend on chondroitin sulfate to have that healthy skeleton. And again, that's going to be the manganese deficiency problem. They are using glyphosate to control seagrass in the waterways along the coast. And so I suspect that that's directly causing the sea star problem, and potentially also causing the coral problem, because the coral also depend on chondroitin sulfate for their structure.
Goodness. So sequestering minerals is one of the inherent ways that glyphosate works. Manganese is one mineral. We know, for example, magnesium is involved in like 350 enzymatic reactions. Is it specific to manganese sequestering, or is it many?
I know, well, that is an excellent question, and I don't have a definite answer. I've been trying to find that out, and I've been reading various articles about the plants, because you can really find out. There's some articles on plants that show dramatic, it shows reduction in the roots of a variety of different minerals. You know, manganese and cobalt are two of them, but there's also iron and zinc. Calcium, not as clear. And magnesium, not as clear too, I think so. But iron and zinc and manganese, and probably selenium and sulfur, are all depleted in the roots, and then even more so in the plant body. So the plant is really depleted in these nutrients, which of course means when you eat that plant, you're not getting a nutritional load. So you're getting a nutrition deficient food that's derived from that plant. So we've got a huge problem with mineral deficiencies in our food that's exposed to glyphosate. And furthermore, then it further depletes the minerals in your gut. And it deprives the lactobacillus of the manganese, and the lactobacillus really needs manganese. It's very interesting that they are unique in that they use manganese as a detoxifying element that other microbes don't. So the lactobacillus are preferentially killed by the glyphosate. And they are an absolutely crucial microbe to get established in your gut when you're born. They're the ones that, you know, lacto, that's milk, right? So those usually would really flourish right after birth and really get a foothold in your gut. And then they will keep the pathogens out because of their presence. So when the lactobacillus gets affected, the pathogens take over the gut. And a particularly a deadly pathogen that will take over is Pseudomonas aeruginosa, because they quite uniquely can metabolize glyphosate. They can actually use glyphosate as a source of food for them. So they are going to really love that environment. And we have an epidemic of infection with Pseudomonas aeruginosa that you can't treat. You give them all kinds of different antibiotics, they don't die. And that's another issue, because papers have been coming out recently that if you are exposed to a low-dose antibiotic over a long period of time, those pathogens in your gut actually develop a skill that allows them to very quickly to become resistant to other antibiotics. This has been shown. And in fact, even glyphosate specifically, it is patented as an antimicrobial agent. And another paper has shown that glyphosate itself, acting as a low-dose antibiotic, can cause certain microbes to become able to resist other antibiotics. So that's how we're getting this kind of massive antibiotic-resistant problem that we face today in the hospitals with this. Pseudomonas is one of them, you know, and we have this MRSA problem, and we have this C. difficile, C. diff, you know, lots of people are having issues with C. diff these days in the hospital. And I think these things are all due to glyphosate. I mean, it's part of the problem. You also, of course, have the antibiotics that they're feeding the animals,
right,
which is also contributing to that problem.
Mm-hmm. Maybe since you touched on that, let's expand upon it, because we know that I think it's about 70% of the antibiotics are not even absorbed by the animals; they're excreted, right? So maybe get into that.
I know, and of course, then that means it's getting into the manure, the antibiotics, and then of course that's another issue because you have these CAFOs, these confined animal feeding operations, with this, you know, all these crowded cows growing in these, you know, very horrible conditions, and they're producing all this manure. And ordinarily, the cows would be out on the grass, and their manure would actually nourish the grass and provide fertilizer for it, which the grass is very happy to have that. But when you sort of have these CAFOs, you get this huge pile of this manure that's contaminated with these antibiotics that you've given them, plus the glyphosate. And so the manure, the microbes in the manure are not healthy, and so they can't actually deal with the manure appropriately in an organic environment, you know. And so that manure that gathers in these kinds of catchment basins, which becomes like a giant sewer, that becomes a very toxic environment to the people around it, and also a source of global warming, because you get improper breaking down of the nitrogen and carbon components, and you end up releasing a lot of nitrous oxide, which is a very strong greenhouse gas, 300 times stronger than carbon dioxide. So I'm suspecting that, and there's similar things are happening on the crops, that the nitrous oxide is being released, or the nitrates are being washed into the waterways, and nitrous oxide is being released from the waterways. So I think nitrous oxide is a very serious greenhouse gas that we've overlooked, and that agriculture is contributing a significant amount of that nitrous oxide, and furthermore, significantly more because of the presence of the glyphosate, which would make me believe that glyphosate is a major contributor to global climate change.
Yeah, we talked about that. So it's affecting the animals, it's affecting humans, it affects our gut bacteria, minerals. And Jeffrey Smith had talked about how glyphosate affects the gut barrier, the epithelium, and kind of these surfactants that help the material get into plants, affects our tissues. So maybe talk about this notion of intestinal permeability or leaky gut. How does glyphosate fit into that picture?
Yes, well, of course, that starts with the pathogens, because it kills off the beneficial bacteria. And this has been shown in chickens, for example, and also there have been studies on pigs that have shown inflamed gut when they're eating these GMO Roundup-ready crops. And so the pathogens bring in the immune system. So the immune cells come in and they start releasing all these oxidative agents that are trying to kill the pathogens, and that's of course also damaging. It's sort of collateral damage to the tissues. There's also, I believe, a serious sulfate deficiency problem that arises from glyphosate, and that's kind of a more complicated story, but I can see how glyphosate, and I talk about that in my papers, it messes up sulfate synthesis, it messes up sulfate transport, and it enhances sulfate loss through the urine. And so I believe sulfate deficiency systemically is behind many of these modern diseases. If the blood is deficient in sulfate, it can't flow properly. But when the gut is deficient in sulfate, then it becomes very leaky. You know, you get all these issues of different undigested materials getting out into the blood, leaking out of the gut. And also, of course, the microbes can also escape the gut, and you can get infection. You can get things like sepsis, and you can get some really serious problems because of your gut problems that are tracing back to the glyphosate exposure to the microbes and the disruption of the sulfate supply.
Okay, so to back up and kind of summarize, glyphosate depletes sulfate, which affects gut bacteria, gut permeability, and then systemic health. Okay.
Good summary.
But does it puncture the gut wall too? Is that?
I don't think it specifically punctures it, but I think that it causes, because of its disruption of the balance of the gut microbes and the overgrowth of the pathogens, and then that attracts the immune cells, and then the immune cells release these toxic chemicals that, in order to kill the microbes, but it also ends up damaging the tissues in the gut.
Right. Interesting. That's fascinating.
And I guess the microbes actually also release toxins, which are going to have an effect, because they're having a war, right?
Yeah, right.
So the toxins that the microbes are releasing are also going to damage the gut.
Sure. That's incredible. We know from gut bacterial diversity studies, Americans have generally, compared to Europeans and Africans, low bacterial diversity. It's just not as, it's not a robust ecosystem. And so would you kind of attribute that? Obviously our diet's not very diverse. We're eating a lot of processed foods and not many tubers, but glyphosate's just reducing bacterial diversity. Is that a fair statement?
I definitely think that's what's going on, yes. And also, of course, we don't eat that many probiotics. We don't eat a lot of fermented foods. And almost every culture has various choices for fermented foods. We used to eat things like sauerkraut and, sour cream I really like, actually. And yogurt, I guess, is something that we eat. But pickles, I mean, those are the kinds of things that, and of course, they're often no longer live
pasteurized or whatever.
Exactly. They've been totally killed. That's part of the issue, is that we're zapping our food with X-rays, and I mean, we're really microwaves. We're just trying to make sure we poison, make sure there's not a single microbe left in it, and that's not good. We really want to be eating live food that's got microbes in it, because the microbes are really going to be important for replenishing and keeping our gut diverse, and that's really going to help to be able to maintain the balance that you need to have a healthy gut.
Sure.
And once you don't have a healthy gut, you're not going to have a healthy brain. There's really very interesting research going on today about the connection between the gut and the brain, and how the gut microbes communicate to the brain and influence the brain, and then you get into all kinds of brain issues, things like brain fog, when the microbes aren't happy.
Wow.
And when you get the leaky gut too, that also leads to leaky brain, leaky brain barrier, and that's the microbes communicating to the brain. Really fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great stuff. Now, speaking of the brain, you talked about how there's this relationship between glyphosate, oxalate, and folate, methylation, and that's a hot topic right now, with MTHFR SNPs and all that. So maybe kind of break that down a little bit for people that aren't familiar with that new understanding.
Yeah, and I'm still trying to figure it out myself, so this is sort of active research right now. The folate turned out to be a very interesting topic, and I'd been aware that folate is a product of the shikimate pathway, and the shikimate pathway is the pathway that glyphosate disrupts, that they claim is its way it kills plants. And actually the enzyme it disrupts depends on manganese, so you can see how that would happen because of the manganese deficiency. But of course that's causing many other problems as well that they're kind of overlooking. When they talk about the shikimate pathway, the Monsanto likes to focus on that pathway because our cells don't have that pathway. And that's why Monsanto argues, and it's a rather plausible argument if you don't know much, that means glyphosate doesn't hurt us, But the problem is that shikimate pathway is really, really important to us in its role that it plays in the microbes, because the microbes, of course, are going to be damaged if that pathway is not working. But worse than that, that pathway produces products that we can't make. We can't make them because we don't have that pathway. And then those products lead to all kinds of amazing molecules that are incredibly important to us. All the neurotransmitters like serotonin, melatonin, thyroid hormone, melanin, the darkening agent in your skin, NAD, which is really important in the liver. These things are all derived from that pathway. And then also folate and vitamin K. And so if that pathway is not, and so the microbes are using that pathway to make our folate. And so we're going to have folate deficiency. And in fact, that's going to lead to things like spina bifida. And they figured that out around 1996. They were seeing spina bifida rates were going up in our country. And then they had these meetings and they worked out and they decided they knew that folate was protective against spina bifida, and so they decided that it was a good idea to start making it obligatory to put folic acid into the bread, into the flour-based, wheat-based products. And they did that. In 1998, they made it mandatory that you have to add this folic acid. So folic acid is different from folate, very different. It's a synthetic form. It's oxidized. And so the liver does have the capability of converting it into the form you need. The form you need is actually methyl tetrahydrofolate. And so you've got to go a long ways to get to that from folic acid. And studies have shown that if the liver has to do this work of converting a lot of folic acid to folate, it will end up blocking the bile acids and causing fatty liver, because of this oxidation damage in the liver. And glyphosate also has been shown to block the bile acids. So they're going to work synergistically to cause harm. The folic acid, which is trying to fix the problem of the folate, which the glyphosate is preventing you from having, is actually making the problem worse in the sense that it's supporting the toxic effect of the glyphosate in the liver.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so that's pretty bad. And then it gets even worse there, because if the liver can't convert all the folic acid to folate, then the folic acid gets into the blood. And that's very abnormal, because it's already a synthetic thing. It's not a natural thing. And the folic acid will cause the blood to become reduced in something called BH4, tetrahydrofolate. And that's crucial for producing nitric oxide, which relaxes the blood and allows the blood to flow. So you will end up with an oxygen deficiency in the brain if you've got too much folic acid in the blood. And that's going to cause an encephalopathy that's characteristic of autism.
Wow.
So that's another whole way the folic acid, and in fact there was a paper I found that actually showed autism rates going up exactly in step with spina bifida going down in connection with introducing folic acid into the diet. And they were proposing in that paper that the folic acid was causal in autism, and I think they're right. It's another piece of the puzzle. So that's all coming, I think, back to the fact that the glyphosate's wrecking the folate, and therefore they're putting in this folic acid, which they think is going to solve the problem, but is actually making the problem worse.
Wow, that's amazing. I think our listeners are going to hit the rewind button a couple times to listen to that. But so let's back up here. Would the natural solution obviously be to get rid of glyphosate in the diet, but also take the activated, because there's 5-MTHF, the 5-methyltetrahydrofolate.
Yes.
Would that kind of help to offset this effect?
Yes, I would hope so. Now, I always feel that supplements are your last choice. I really would much rather eating whole foods and eating organic, and somehow making your system, letting your microbes make the folate for you. That's the right answer, really, if you can. But I think if you have a major deficiency, it might be appropriate, and if so, you would definitely, if you're going to try to take a folate supplement, you definitely want to do that. You do not want to take the folic acid.
Gosh, because that's adding insult to injury. Just like we had talked about earlier when we started this synergistic effect where these toxins. So folic acid and glyphosate are not a good combination.
They work together to destroy the liver.
And affect the brain.
Yes, and then affect the brain, yes.
And the bile acids, I think we're seeing a reemergence of how important they are for our physiology.
Yes, that's
there's
another one.
There's bioreceptors in our heart and our brain and all over, so we think that they're just saponifying dietary fats, turning the fats we eat into soap so we can absorb them, but they're doing so many beneficial effects.
That's true, and they're actually really complicated, and I don't have a complete handle on them yet, but I'm reading more and more every day about the bile acids, because I think that's actually a crucial part of glyphosate's toxicity. And glyphosate disrupts the bile acids. That's been shown in studies in fish, that the bile ducts were blocked. And that makes sense because the CYP enzymes are being disrupted, and those are crucial for making the bile acids. So it makes total sense. When the bile isn't flowing, one of the things is that the manganese doesn't get distributed. That's one of the reasons why you're getting problems with the manganese. The manganese is going to end up staying in the liver and not going back, because usually it's exported through the bile acids, and then it eventually works its way into the blood. So it goes kind of, there's a distribution system that needs to be working properly. So the manganese becomes actually toxic in the liver while it's deficient everywhere else. And the liver has to unload that manganese some other way. So what it does is it just shifts it up the vagus nerve to the brainstem. And wherever else the vagus nerve goes, just kind of shifts, because the manganese uniquely is able to travel along nerve fibers, which is really fascinating. I've read some really interesting papers about manganism, which is caused by oral exposure to manganese. People who work in an environment where manganese is released, and they breathe it in, they get it into their nose, it goes down the olfactory nerve and ends up in the brainstem and causes manganism, which is very much like Parkinson's disease. And so I actually think the manganese that's coming from the liver is causative in Parkinson's disease. And Parkinson's disease is one of the diseases that's going up in step with glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops.
That's amazing. You're such an abstract thinker. Where did that come from? How did you develop that?
It might be my training, right, in computer science. I think it might be, because I really do think that computer scientists think very differently from biologists. I'm very surprised by the biology. I mean, the biologists are brilliant, and they've done a lot of really great work, and I love it. And my favorite thing is to get a new paper that looks like it's got on a topic I'm really interested in, and it's got some real good biological detail, and I want to sit and read it, you know, and I love that. So I don't want to take anything away from them. But what's puzzling to me is that they don't seem to be inclined to ask why. And so they'll just, write a descriptive story of this is what happens, this is this chemical pathway, and then this thing gets disrupted. And then they're just not, and I always think that everything the body does, it's doing it for a reason. So whenever I see something happening, like let's say encephalopathy, I'm going to say, well, why does the body want to react? Because I feel like the biology is really, really clever. And even the encephalopathy, I say it has to have a positive benefit. And you look at seizures, for example, it has to have a positive benefit. And I am seeing that benefit of the seizures. And of course, autism has seizures connected to it. And I wrote a paper, even before I had talked about glyphosate, before I even knew about glyphosate, I wrote a paper on encephalopathy. And it was really fascinating what I found, because I saw all this process that takes place in the brain in a situation where there's an encephalopathy attack, where you have this brain swelling, and then the mitochondria actually ditch their glutamate and they replace it with ammonia. So they get the taurine out of the mitochondria, and they replace it with ammonia, and then they put glutamate, and all this orchestration of all this complex set of events, which has I believe, the consequence of producing sulfate from taurine. This is what the paper talks about. And the sulfate is essential. So what's happening is the brain is desperate for sulfate, and I think that the brain, the heart, and the liver, they all are known to have very high levels of taurine stored. And that taurine, I believe, is a reserve sulfate supply. Taurine is usually quite inert. It's like they think that taurine can't be broken down because it's so stable. But you have to kind of do all these shenanigans to get the taurine to react, including the seizures and the high fever. I mean, all these things are helping to provide energy so that you can pull that sulfate out of that taurine.
Interesting.
So it's really fascinating stuff. And I think that's what's going on in a heart attack as well, that the heart attack is causing the heart to be able to recover sulfate from taurine.
Wow, that's fascinating. Because that's the highest concentration of taurine in the body, is that right?
In the heart, you're right. Oh, you know your numbers.
A little bit, and not as much.
Yes, it's very interesting that the heart stores huge amounts of taurine, and it's not something people can explain, but of course I want to explain it, and I know that sulfate deficiency in the heart is a critical issue in heart health, you know, that it's going to cause things like heart failure. So when the heart gets desperate enough, it's willing to do the heart attack in order to produce the sulfate from the taurine. That's what I think is going on.
Interesting, yeah. I've seen some correlation studies of elevated serum sulfate linked with heart disease, and it may be that the body's trying to raise levels, like you're saying, because at the cellular level is deficient, potentially.
Well, that's the problem, actually, because serum sulfate has to be kept very, very low. Sulfate is so interesting because it'll gel water. It'll turn it into jello. And so you can't put a lot of sulfate in the blood, or else the blood won't flow. This is the problem that biology faces. It's a very big challenge. And biology has lots of ways to get around it. And most of those involve attaching the sulfate to other molecules that will disperse the negative charge and prevent the sulfate from having that kind of an effect. And the molecules that do that are members of two major classes. One of them is the aromatic amino acids that are produced by the shikimate pathway. So by virtue of glyphosate disrupting that, then you lose those sulfate carriers, and you can't transport sulfate. And the other one is the sterols, and that's the cholesterol, the DHEA, the vitamin D. These things are all sulfate carriers because they're all shipped sulfated. And so the body is distributing the sulfate on the backs of these molecules. And when they're deficient, the sulfate doesn't get distributed. And that's what's going on in the liver with the bile acid blocking, because the bile acids carry a lot of sulfates into the gut. And that's why if the bile isn't flowing, the gut's going to become deficient in sulfate. And also because the serotonin's not there, and serotonin is produced in huge amounts in the blood, and it's also sulfated when it's shipped. So that's part of how you get all the problems with the sulfate deficiency. So free sulfate becomes high in association with heart disease because the heart is desperate for sulfate, and the carriers are not available. And so the body's desperate enough to try to raise the level of free sulfate, which is going to cause a risk of the blood not flowing. So when you get a no-flow situation, you're in huge trouble. You can get multiple organ failure. And that is actually a cause of death that's rising in the US CDC hospital discharge data right now. Multiple organ failure, which is because the blood is unable to flow.
Yeah, blood viscosity. We had Ralph Holsworth. He's written a lot about this and so forth, and has found that it's really independently correlated with, like you said, many organ issues, but also heart disease. But it's not looked at. It's like C-reactive protein, lipids. Oh, those look good. You're okay. You're good to go, doctor. But we know that the blood can be viscous, and that's really interesting.
Right.
So,
well, in fact, without enough buffering, you know, you're walking a tightrope between hemorrhaging and blood clots. You know, that's what's happening to all the old people. They're all in such a fragile state with their blood. It's just like so. The minerals are not there. The buffers aren't there to maintain healthy blood, and particularly the sulfate.
Wow, Fascinating. So we have the mitochondria being perturbed, minerals are being sequestered, we have changes in gut bacteria, we have bile acids, we have this relationship between folic acid. Is there anything else you want
Estrogen disruption.
Let's talk about it.
Yes, and I've been, and Anthony Samsel, I have to say, he told me a long time ago, he says, glyphosate is an estrogen disruptor. It's an estrogenic agent. And I was like, well, I'm not sure, I'm not sure I believe that. So, so it took me a while, I wasn't sure. But then, I saw this article on breast, it was breast cancer cells grown in vitro, and they exposed them to parts per trillion levels of glyphosate. That is an incredibly tiny amount. And those breast cancer cells started proliferating. So the glyphosate in very small amounts could cause those cancer cells to proliferate. And of course, they respond to estrogen. So that was, and these people were saying it's an estrogenic agent. And of course, things that have that kind of hormonal behavior have an unusual characteristic of their toxicity where it's U-shaped. So when you're looking, you're saying, here's my lower limit and here's my upper limit, and I'm seeing this linear rise, I can go below the lower limit and I can also see a linear rise, and I don't realize that. So when they study the glyphosate, again, the folks who have claimed it's safe, they got nowhere near the levels that they needed to be at on the low end to demonstrate this estrogenic behavior. And I'm seeing, for example, in Kauai, where I have a second home, I love Kauai, but in the south side of Kauai, there's a major problem with the agrochemical companies growing there. They're developing their new GMOs that are resistant to toxic chemicals in the fields around this area in the small town of Waimea. And in that town, the women have incredibly heavy menstrual cycles. Their periods are really heavy, and so that is an indication of excess estrogen exposure. And you're also seeing in the country, you're seeing, of course, there's the infertility issues, there's the endometriosis and fibroids. All this kind of growth of the uterine growth is evidence of excess estrogen exposure. And so, and I think that's making sense to say that estrogen, and of course there's also a rising breast cancer incidence. I have been hearing so many people, I have people I know, multiple people that I know right now are experiencing issues with breast cancer. It seems like an incredible epidemic. Unfortunately, I can't get numbers from the CDC because their numbers end in 2010, but it was going up starting in 2006, and then it just ends at 2010, and I suspect it's continuing to go up, the breast cancer. And I'm suspecting that that's due to the glyphosate. And they saw that, Seralini saw that in his studies where he looked at these rats and all the massive mammary tumors that these rats had when they were exposed to glyphosate over their lifetime. So all of that's pointing to estrogenic behavior.
Now, do you know the mechanism? Is it a SERM? Is it affecting, is it a phytoestrogen? Like, how is it raising or affecting our own endogenous estrogen? Yeah,
now I guess it might be, and I don't actually know the answer. I mean, it is acting as if it is estrogen, and whether that means that it just happens to have a physical shape that fits the estrogen receptor, I'm not sure. I don't actually know, and that's one reason why I was resisting believing that, because I didn't quite understand how that was happening. All the other things I've talked about, I can understand how that would happen, but this one I don't really quite understand how it would do that. But there are all these chemicals that are estrogenic. It seems to be really quite a common feature of these toxic chemicals, many of them that are in our environment, which is quite fascinating, quite surprising to me also. But really, really tiny amounts have huge impact, which is what's so scary with these estrogenic chemicals. And we've got a huge problem with them, not just glyphosate, there's many others, as you know.
Right, yeah, and what's scary about that is our own hormones, testosterone, estrogen, and so forth, have binding proteins, globulin, sex hormone binding globulin. These other, minute estrogen, like you said, small levels have a profound effect because they exist in the free state. So that when they're in the bloodstream, they're not bound up to these proteins. They can go stimulate receptors and be problematic.
That's a really good point. And they're completely unregulated, and you have no control over it, because our bodies are very good at producing the exact right amount that's needed. Like if you go through pregnancy and you orchestrate, this progesterone increase, all these different changes that happen in your sex hormones during pregnancy, and if you superimpose on that all this junk that's coming in and just adding noise, then how's the baby going to develop appropriately? And we are seeing all kinds of issues with genetic defects in the children. I mean, I'm actually shocked. I have a new paper that's been accepted for publication, collaborating with Nancy Swanson, who's the one who's really found all these correlations, all these health correlations with glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops. She and I are having a delightful time collaborating. And we're collaborating with a third person, Judy Hoy, who's an expert on wildlife in Montana, and she's seeing all kinds of damage to the wildlife which are being exposed to the chemicals that are being used on the adjacent farms. And so we took her data, Judy Hoy's data, and saw what was happening to them. Then we looked at the humans' data from the CDC hospital discharge data to see what was going on in humans, and then relating that to the glyphosate levels, and everything's matching up. It's really pretty amazing. We're finding, for example, congenital heart defects going up dramatically in the infant population in step with glyphosate usage on corn and soy crops. And we're finding lung issues and issues with the lymph system and failure to thrive. I mean, all these things are going up. U.S. is doing terribly on infant mortality, and then all these different issues that the infants are having with their health. Very bizarre new problems are showing up with the infants today that the doctors can't even explain. It's just really tragic what's happening.
Pretty scary. Yeah.
It is. It's very scary.
Yeah. Well, thanks for doing all the research and helping us spread this message. It's very important. And anything else that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to cover?
Yes, there's a lot. And there's,
Yeah.
I think we can quit. We covered a huge amount. I'm actually very pleased with this conversation. I thought it went very well, and I thought you allowed me an opportunity to talk about many different aspects. This chemical, I like to talk about the many faces of glyphosate because it's just amazing how many different ways it can disrupt your physiology. And I guess there is actually one more, which I don't know if I touched enough upon it, which is anemia. And anemia is another one of these things, an epidemic. And then they're thinking iron deficiency, so they're giving iron supplements, but that's not actually going to fix the problem, because the problem is that the red blood cells are being attacked by the glyphosate. And I've seen many different ways in which the glyphosate is going to disrupt the red blood cells. One of those is the sulfate issue, because if the red blood cells don't have enough cholesterol sulfate, they will hemolyze, they will fall apart. So they're getting a shortened lifespan. And then when the body tries to produce new red blood cells, they need to make heme. So you basically are breaking down the heme, and that's releasing free iron, which is toxic. And then the liver, you need to construct new heme to make the hemoglobin that's going to go into the brand new red blood cells that are being minted. And glyphosate disrupts the first step in heme synthesis, which is the first step in the production of the pyro ring that goes into heme. So it'll get you coming and going on the red blood cells. So it's no wonder we've got anemia. And you see these people with the sort of dark shadows under their eyes, and I suspect that's being caused by glyphosate.
It's really common. I worked in a clinical setting, and a lot of women have, real low ferritin, real low serum iron, and again, you just blame it on take iron. Here's IV iron, and it's like, why are we seeing all these issues?
Very good. I'm glad to hear you say that, because I'm just seeing it in the data, and you're experiencing it firsthand, and so that's amazing. It's just, we're just sort of having this silent epidemic that's going on, and all these different things. And people just going about their lives as if everything's fine. That's what's really puzzling to me. Why aren't people seeing? And people like you are seeing it because you're in the trenches. And most people, they just hear about some neighbor that's got breast cancer and some other neighbor that's got this autistic kid, and you're kind of like, these things are all, and then you just, oh yeah, that's just the new normal. That's just the way the world is. It's just like amazing to me that people just sit back and say, oh yeah, well that's fine, life goes on. And we're just going to go over the cliff. I mean, it's just like
scary stuff.
Very strange. We live in a very strange world, so we need to wake up. We need to do something different.
Yeah. Now, along those lines, if you were to say bump shoulders with President Barack Obama or a future president, and they turned to you and said, why is glyphosate bad, or what should I know about glyphosate? And just in a short 30 seconds, what would you share with them?
Wow.
What sort of message would you want them to?
That's so hard to do in 30 seconds. Wow. Yeah, well, I guess I'd have to say that although you think glyphosate is safe because you think the companies have proven that it's safe, that is simply not true. And glyphosate is, and it's clear that we're getting a huge problem with our gut microbes, and it's very clear that glyphosate is going to disrupt them. And then following that, there's all kinds of other issues with respect to the products that those microbes would produce for you if they were working that aren't there. And that has a cascade effect. The disruption of your gut is going to cause the disruption of your brain because of the gut-brain axis, and you're going to get various issues with diseases like autism and ADHD and Alzheimer's and all these things that we're finding. And then on top of that, sort of other physical problems. And so we're facing an incredible health crisis today because I think because of glyphosate. Glyphosate is a huge issue that if we don't fix it, we're going to basically bankrupt the country with the expenses, the medical expenses. So this is an emergency that absolutely needs to be dealt with immediately. We need to withdraw, we need to ban glyphosate from the market in the country. We need to do that right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Awesome. Now, if we could wrap up the prevention tips. So eat organic, take 5-MTHF, or get whole foods. Like, what would you tell to parents or parents to be, and then just people that want to be healthy?
Yes, eat organic is absolutely the most important. Eat foods that are rich in, and so once you're organic, then you can eat foods that are rich in sulfur and rich in manganese, rich in cholesterol, actually, and healthy
cholesterol.
fats.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So, for example, organic eggs is a wonderful choice because they're not that expensive, and I think they're a bargain compared to the poor eggs because they have much more nutritional value, and they don't have the toxic chemicals. Eggs are a whole. They're providing the entire nutrition that the egg needs to make a chick. So when you think about that, that's got to be a lot of balanced nutrition with a lot of minerals and vitamin A and cholesterol and healthy fats and all these great things. So seafood is also very healthy, and fish and grass-fed beef, and then lots of green vegetables, especially the ones that are good sources of sulfur, like broccoli and onions and garlic. Garlic is fantastic. I try to eat a lot of garlic for the sulfur. Mm-hmm. And then if you're trying to detox, what I've heard, and I've heard this from the animal husbandry domain, is elements from the soil, fulvic acid, humic acid, bentonite clay, that those are all, they have found that if they feed those to the cows, they've actually tested the glyphosate before and after in the urine and found that it reduced the levels of glyphosate in the urine, and it also improved the cow's health. So, and they believe that that would do that. I guess they maybe it binds the glyphosate and gets it out. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but that's really good to know. And they've also got some exotic herbs that are actually, dandelions apparently, have something in them that is effective for detoxing glyphosate. So I found an interesting paper that talked about these sort of herbal plants that I hadn't heard of before, and I can't give you their names, but so there is some interesting herbal possibilities for detoxing glyphosate. I imagine those things will start to catch on.
Sure.
People can look into that.
Right. That's amazing. So I'm sure listeners want to connect with you and follow your work and so forth. What's the best online channel or resource or web page where people can learn more about your work?
Yeah, I have a web page. It's people, P-E-O-P-L-E, .CSAIL, Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, CSAIL, .mit.edu/Seneff, S-E-N-E-F-F. And it's not pretty, but I just kind of slap a bunch of stuff up there so you can get my papers and my slides from my talks. I try to put a lot of that material on my page, also some of my interviews and things like that. So
fantastic.
That's a place to look. And then there's also, of course, just Googling my name.
Yeah.
And you'll find the articles that are saying that I'm a quack, so you can start with those.
Right.
And then you can decide if you still want to watch, you know. It's up to you.
Fantastic. Well, keep up the great work, and thanks for being on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.